Hello everyone, I'm the 12th Women's World Chess Champion Alexandra Kostyniuk, and I'm happy to carry on with my video course about endgames, absolutely must-know endgames. And today we're gonna talk about endgames where a knight tries to make a draw versus a rook. Well, to start with, those endgames generally are drawn. It's quite easy to make a draw if you just follow some simple rules. For example, on the diagram, we can see an endgame from the game Hikaru Nakamura Levon Aronian, just played recently in the Rapid Chess Championship on Chess.com. And Levon made quite an easy draw, holding this position with just 1 second increment time. What one should know in order to make a draw: you should try to keep your knight and your king as close to each other as possible, because there is no other pieces left on the board in order to protect your knight. So your king should stand by and defend your knight if it's needed. And we can see that Levon made quite an easy draw. Okay, Hikaru tried to rotate the direction and to play on, because I'm not sure if I've mentioned it before, but in order to claim a draw in an over-the-board game, in a practical game, you need to make 50 moves. With if there are no exchanges, no pawns moves, on the 50th move you can claim a draw. And so you need to hold on for 50 moves, and that's what Levon did. And actually at the end, Hikaru just gave up the rook and it was a draw. So basically, these endgames are drawn. Just keep your knight and your king close together, and let your king do the work. It's getting trickier if your pieces are pushed back to the edge of the board. As usual, it's still a draw, and for example, this endgame is quite funny because you can find the same exact position in many endgames manuals, and the same exact position, this one, happened during the World Rapid Championship 2021 in one of the games. Salem was playing white, Dudin was playing black, and it's a draw, but black needs to be careful. So white tried king f6, and here the first accurate move, the needed move to be played is knight to h7. That's what black played, because in fact king h8 loses quite easily after rook e8, king g8, and then king e7, or any actually move on the 8th rank. Rook d8, winning the knight and the game. So knight h7 is the move to continue, and that's how black played. King g6, knight f8 check, king h6, king h8, rook f7, back to g8. It's important not to move your knight here, because if you play knight to e6, then you might end up losing the game after rook f6 and then followed by rook f8. So king g8 needs to be played. That's how the game continued. Rook g7, king h8, rook g4. And here another crossroad, very important moment. Black has 3 moves with his knight. Well, this one we won't really count, 4 moves, but knight g6 loses, not because of rook takes g6, which leads to a stalemate, but because of king takes g6, winning the game. So we need to pick which one is the best move. Knight h7 loses due to king to g6, and after king to g8, rook goes and wait to g2 or g1, and after knight f8, the king gets to f7, and that's crucial. That's why it's so bad to be in the corner, because after knight h7, unfortunately, rook g8 is a checkmate. There is no h9 on the chessboard, so black loses. So knight h7 loses because of king g6. Knight e6 loses again because of king g6. If knight f8, then king f7. If king g8, then king f6. Discovered check, winning the knight. And so there is only one move left, which is knight d7, and that's exactly how black played, and that is the right move to play. Rook g3. was played in the game. If white plays rook d4, then the knight will just go to f8, and the king is just in time to protect the knight. Rook g3 was played, knight f8, rook g1, again same story, knight d7, and after rook g2 and a few more moves, players agreed on a draw. If black plays king to g6 here, then king g8 will follow, rook d1, knight f8 check, king f6, knight h7, and black holds a draw. That's a very important position to know in order to save the game if your king and knight pushed back to the edge of the board. Often, rook versus knight endgames arise after rook versus pawn endgames. That we're gonna discuss later on this video course. But in order to play on here for white, as we can see, h8 queen loses immediately due to rook a8 checkmate, and the only move that carries on a little bit more is h8 knight check, but unfortunately, and that's one exception to the basic rook versus knight are usually drawn endgames, except when the king and the knight of the weaker side are in the corner. And actually the order doesn't matter. It can be the king and the knight here, so the king on g8, the knight on h8, or vice versa. It's still gonna be lost if the stronger side king is close to the knight and the king, as it's here. So h8 knight check loses to king f6, and it's Zugzwang, because if white plays king f8, then rook a8 will follow. Otherwise, white loses the knight. The situation is a little bit different if we shift the position towards the center, and as we can see, again, white's pawn is under attack. If white promotes this pawn, it's going to be a checkmate, so the only move, and actually the best move that can save you a game, is under promotion into a knight with a check. That's a very important thing. And after king e6, actually this is a position from the game Gustav Neumann Wilhelm Steinitz. White promoted the pawn, under-promoted his pawn, and then played king h6, rook h7, and here one more important rule to remember, we actually already discussed it, that you need to keep the king and the knight as close together as possible, because when the knight and the king are separated, the knight can be lost. And here white, instead of moving his knight back to g8, and this position is a drawn position, black can try to attack and give a few checks, but white should hold. In the game, white played knight to g4, and actually it's a losing move because of rook h3. Rook h3 was the strongest move to continue, and we see that white is in Zugzwang because there is nowhere to go for the knight. If the king goes to e8, well, then the checkmate will come to h8. In the game, the first world champion continued with rook h4. This move is also winning, but just it takes longer. Although after rook h4, Steinitz played perfectly. Let's see how he won the knight. So little by little, with maneuvering the knight, the rook, he takes out more and more space from this knight, and black king approaches, and at the end, there is a very nice trap. The king controls the squares on the c file, the rook controls the squares on the b file. So the knight is trapped, and that's how black won, because white moved his knight too far away from his king. You should always try to keep them as close as possible. When preparing this video, I found another very interesting example from a chess.com titled Tuesday Blitz game between two grandmasters. Dmitry Andreikin was playing white, Rasmus Svane was playing black, and we can see a typical position where knight tries to make a draw versus a rook. It's a draw, this position is draw, but white has the only move to proceed. And this move is king to f1. It's very important to play king f1 in order, after king f3, to make another only move, which is knight to d1. We've seen this position where black was playing on the 8th rank, similar position, and this one is a drawn position which is good to remember because it looks scary, especially considering the fact that after rook e2, white needs to play knight c3. And again, when the knight and the king are separated, it does look scary. But after rook c2, the knight goes back to d1. After rook d2, the king comes to e1, and then knight d1 becomes possible. And this position is a drawn position. In fact, in the game, white played king to g1, and this is already a lost position. Although it's quite tricky and complicated, but the knight doesn't get back in time to the king. And there are several ways black can win. In the game, they blundered. They played king to e2, and white could have saved the game by giving a fork. You should always remember about forks when playing against knights. Instead of king e2, black can win, but I suggest you to find this winning method on your own. It will be a good exercise if you wish. There are several ways to win. One more thing to discuss. I already mentioned that when the knight and the king are in the corner, these positions are often lost if the pieces of the stronger side is well placed. Also, there is one more square to avoid for your knight when trying to save this endgames is the square b7 or g7 or g2 or b2. These squares are like blind spots for the knight. And actually this position is very interesting because Dvoretsky in his endgame manual tells us that this position was first published and discovered in Arab manuscripts in the 9th century. And actually at that time there was a game called Shatranj, so it was a little bit different from the modern chess. Rules were different, but kings, rooks and knights moved the same way as they move today. And already in the 9th century it was discovered that with the knight on b7 this position is lost. The best way for white to win is rook d1, and after king b8 there is another very important move to remember. In order to win, white needs to play king a6. King c6 wins as well, but it's long and complicated, and eventually white will need to get back to this position. In fact, king a6 is much easier. It's very important to keep these two files open, because king b6 is already a draw after king c8. There is no way to win this knight. While after king a6, if black plays king c8 or king c7, then rook c1 will follow, king b8, rook b1. There is a trick after king a8, a stalemate trick, because rook takes b7 is not possible. White needs to play king b6, and then if king b8, then king c6, king 8, king c7. We've already seen this kind of ideas and how important it is to get to c7 when this king is on a8, when this king is in the corner, and white wins. If black plays knight d6, then rook d1, knight c8, king c7, again, once more to this important square, and after knight e7, rook d8 wins the knight and the game. So instead of king c7 or king c8, knight c5 can be tried, but unfortunately for black, after knight c5, king b6, the knight is obliged to go to a4, and then, because if knight goes, let's try to play knight b7, but then I suppose rook d7 will be played, and if king goes to a8, white can make a waiting move somewhere. Maybe it's not the fastest way, because rook takes b7 is a stalemate, so let's try rook h7 and then rook h8, winning the knight. So knight a4, but unfortunately this knight is too far away and the king cannot longer support this knight, and it's lost like this. King comes closer, and after knight a4, rook a1, winning. So a very useful endgame to remember. One more very complicated example, just to show you that even grandmasters sometimes are not able to apply all this knowledge and rules. They know that this endgame is a drawn endgame, but in a practical game it's not so easy. It's an endgame from the game Kamsky Bakro, and this position is a drawn position, but there are many difficult moments for the weaker side. In the game Black played knight to g2. It's still okay, but probably a little bit easier would be to play knight c2. Again, a very scary moment since the knight goes quite far away from the black king, but after king to f3, king f1 will follow, and after rook c8, for example, knight gets back to e1 with a check, holding a draw. Knight d3 here loses because of king f3, knight e1. We've seen something similar closer to the edge of the board. Knight e1, king g2, and again there are different moves to win. The fastest move that wins is rook e8, although it kind of looks strangely, but again, if the king goes to h1, we get to f2. If the knight goes to f4, king f3, and white wins the knight. If the knight goes to h4, rook e4, and again, we kind of forces black to get to the h file and get to the f2 square. Quite complicated lines. The game continued with knight g2. I just want to show you fast where black blundered, king to f3, and here the only move that holds is knight to h4. It's not an easy move to find. After king e3, it's important to get to g2 or h2 with your king, because knight g2 loses again to king e2. But in the game, king f1 was played, and actually the game was repeated. The position was repeated, so white didn't find the winning move straight away, but then they managed to find this very poisonous waiting move, rook f7, and after knight e1, king to e3, the position is won again, although in the game white made a mistake one more time, and black had a chance to save the game here in this position. They played king to e2, and I think nobody will believe that in this situation knight d7 saves the game. It's still an equal position according to the table basis, but in a practical game I think it's almost impossible to hold this position with your knight being so far away from your king. And instead black played knight f7, and white managed to win little by little, bringing the king and the rook closer to the knight, and at the end trapping the knight and winning it. So here black resigned because of knight f7, rook f8, pinning and winning. So that's it. I know a lot of examples and information, but again, the most important thing is this kind of endgames, rook versus knight, are usually drawn. You need to hold on, if you're playing with a knight, for 50 moves in order to be able to claim a draw. You need to try to keep your knight and your king as close together as possible in order for your king to protect the knight. And if your pieces are pushed to the edge of the board, remember to avoid corners, because the knight cannot really protect the king if it's trapped to the corner. And try not to leave your king, because if the knight goes too far away, it can be trapped. So good luck and see you soon.